This week's Parashat, we read the pasuk V'chalta v'savata v'yarachta. It's the source of Birchas Hamazon. Perhaps the only bracha, the question of Birchas HaTorah, but Birchas Hamazon definitely is a bracha which we're obligated from the Torah, the Iraisa, to make a bracha after every time we eat bread. We know that the brachas of Birchas Hamazon, there are 4 brachas. It contains 4 brachas. Birchas Hazon es Hakol, which we're told in the Gemara that Moshe Rabbeinu established he wrote the first bracha when we got the man in the Midbar. And Moshe Rabbeinu said we have to always thank Hashem for His sustenance, for His bread that He gives us. Then when Yeshua came into Eretz Yisrael, he wrote the second bracha, Al Ha'aretz ve'al Hamazon, on the land and on the Mazon, because without Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, we're not a complete nation. We're a complete nation only when we're in Eretz Yisrael. Then came David HaMelech and his son Shlomo HaMelech, and they spoke about the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, about the Kedusha of not only of Eretz Yisrael, but of Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash. B'nai Yerushalayim, they said the bracha B'nai Yerushalayim. What about the 4th bracha, Hatoiv, which is called in the words of Chazal, Hatoiv HaMeitiv? When was that bracha established? So Chazal, very interesting source for that bracha. When the Yidden, after the Churban Abayis Sheni, the Yidden were under the Roman Empire, but there was a group of Yidden that held out and they rebelled against the Roman Empire. And it was about 60 years after the Churban Abayis. The last station, the last place of this rebellion was in Beitar, and the Romans viciously rooted out this rebellion and killed and destroyed the entire army that was left, the army of the rebels against the Romans. And then they made a terrible takana that we were not allowed to bury the dead. Even after the terrible destruction, the dead remained on the street for many, many years. Some say 12, 13, 14 years. The dead remained on the streets until we were able to bury them. Then one day, the authority the Roman authority changed. There was a new empire, a new emperor, and he gave permission for the Yidden to bury the dead of Beitar. At that moment, the Chazal, the Chachamim in that generation, they wrote a 4th bracha, Hatoiv v'hameitiv. Why Hatoiv v'hameitiv? The good and he who does good. The good is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who gave the possibility of burying our dead. V'hameitiv, there was a special nace that the bodies remained whole. They didn't disintegrate, even though they were out on the street for so many years, for 14 years. So they made a bracha, Hatoiv v'hameitiv. And now every time a Jew eats bread, he says the bracha of not only Hazon HaSakol, so Mazon Ben Yisrael, also Hatoiv v'hameitiv, in commemoration of the story that happened in Beitar. Very interesting. It's a blip in history. It's a very important moment in history, of course, that after the rebellion, the Romans Hashem gave the possibility that the Romans allowed us to bury the dead. But because of that, we have a bracha every time a Jew eats bread. He remembers the story, not the story of Beitar, but the story that we were allowed to bury the dead of Beitar. That's such an important point that it remains forever enshrined in our Birchas Hamazon. And this happened, by the way, on the 15th of Av, which just passed the date, Tu B'Av. That's one of the reasons why it's a Yom Tov, Tu B'Av. A Yom Tov was established, and a bracha in Birchas Hamazon. Why is it so important? Says the Meshech Chochmah, or Samech, Meir Simcha of Dvinsk writes in Meshech Chochmah. He writes, yes, it's a very important moment, because at that moment, Chazal knew, the Chazal of that generation knew that we're in for a very long ride of our Galus. It may be 5 years, it may be 100 years, maybe 1,000. They didn't know how long it would be, but it would be a long ride, and it would be not an easy ride. And there'll be times during the Galus that Yidden will lose hope. They'll say, oh, so many years passed, and so many troubles befell us, and Hashem is not returning us to Eretz Yisrael. Maybe it's never going to happen. Said the Chazal of Beitar, no, it will happen. Look, we went through terrible psychological depression. That when the Romans told us not to bury the dead, it was a terrible shock. Every day a Yid leaves his house, he goes to the store, he comes back, he sees the dead people lying on the street. For years and years and years, this sight of destruction, of despair met our eyes every single day. But then you know what happened? One day everything changed. A new Roman Empire, a new Roman emperor, new laws, you can bury the dead. Just like it happened then, said Chazal, can happen anytime. And every time a Yid benches, and every year on the 15th of Av, we have to remember that moment. That even though we just passed the Tisha B'Av, even though we just passed a terrible, tragic day of Tisha B'Av, and we recounted all the tragedies that happened, and again we fall into depression, maybe we're never going to get out of this gulf. No, we will get out of this gulf. It can happen in 1 second. It can change in 1 second. It can change in 1 minute, says the Medrash. And this is such an important point to keep us alive and to keep us with our faith alive throughout the years of Galus, that we have to say it every single day in Birchas Hamazon. Every time we eat bread, we have to say this 4th bracha, Hatoiv v'hameitiv, and we have to remember and recall the dead of Beitar and the fact that everything can change in 1 second, maybe in our days, b'mehera v'yameinu. Good Shabbos.